Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. In this video I'm going to walk you through my final year portfolio, which I somehow haven't filmed yet. You guys really liked the last one, so I'm hoping that this can be quite useful for anyone currently doing their masters or about to consider their masters. So for a bit of context, I studied at the University of Greenwich in London, and I was in Unit 18 from 2022 to 2023 for my final year. The brief for that year was called Fluid Speculation, and I'll read you a bit of the brief. In our continuous mission to streamline our lifestyles through technological advancement, we have created an ever-growing climactic monster that rages, disrupts, and destroys our fragile planet, leaving nothing but ecological scars in its wake. This year, we will explore these spoils through the lens of weather, and in particular water, which often takes center stage during an environmental crisis. My project is called New Paradisa, and I'll kind of get into the name and the image on the front a bit later, but I'll start with some research that I did at the beginning of the year. So I was quite inspired by my recent trip to India right before this year had begun, and I visited the Taj Mahal in particular. So I started looking into the Mughal Empire, particularly their literature, paintings, miniatures, and kind of wanted to take water as the central theme throughout my project. So, water is depicted in numerous ways in Mughal paintings, and I found this really lovely sort of architectural concept called the charbagh, which is four gardens. And these charbaghs were depicted in carpets, in literature, paintings, and I tried to find, similar sources that depicted these charbaghs. Now, these gardens, also known as paradise gardens, were a way for the Mughal empires to have a slice of paradise in their own palaces, and I found this a really nice concept. Um, and so I started looking into Persian carpets as well, so you'll see that these two themes kind of run throughout the project as a whole. The first exercise I did was to do a couple of collages. One is a miniature sort of collage using existing elements from previous sources, as well as a plan collage where I took different plans of charbaghs and constructed them to make up what this collage might look like. And this was a really nice exercise to kind of do at the beginning, just to get my creative juices flowing and figure out what kind of thing I wanted to design and build. Then I did some more research into Persian carpets, and you'll notice that my portfolio is quite research heavy, especially for the first half of the year. And I think that's really what allowed my project to be as rich and kind of detailed as possible, because I zoomed in on every single level. So for these Persian carpets, I kind of found out that every carpet tells its own story. Some might be from a specific region or tribe or village. Others might be telling a specific story, like this one, which is of a hunting scene. And even the construction of the carpet is very particular and has a lot of meaning and thought behind it. So everything from the border to the choice of color to then the patterns that are used throughout the carpet as well. And I did another deep dive into what these patterns resemble and symbolize, and this kind of made for a very basic sort of driver at this stage in the project. So for example, this first collage is called the Garden of the Soul, second one is called the Garden of the Heart, and I think this was probably my best work in that first term, because it really just allowed me to bring together Mughal miniatures and the things that they represented, but also the modern equivalents. So for example, with this first collage, I've included things like cypress trees and herbal medicine, but also if you zoom in, you can see that there are pharmaceutical medicine and modern medicine included as well, to kind of depict this idea that now in today's age we rely heavily on, modern medicine to cure us, to keep us alive longer, and that kind of very ephemeral concept. These two are the Garden of the Spirit and the Garden of the Essence, and you'll see that each kind of collage or tapestry, whatever you want to call it, has a color theme throughout. And I think this is something that I quite like doing visually, because it just makes all the elements come together a lot more seamlessly as well. And you'll see this kind of circle back towards the end of the project too. I then took those kind of ideas of translating sort of concepts and things that we value in a modern sense. So I took this Hirati pattern, which kind of showcases this sort of diamond floral arrangement, and translated it into a modern equivalent with materialistic items, so particularly designer items, which I then kind of built through existing models on SketchUp as a 3D version and then translated it into 2D patterns. And this is another core driver that kind of goes through my project, which is this idea of flipping through 3D to 2D, because a carpet, although it's 3D, it's often viewed from above, which is more of a 2D projection. And I wanted to play on this idea and see how it can work within a city in terms of its scale, in terms of how it's constructed. And so I started developing these kind of series of patterns, experimenting with different angles and views, and exporting different kinds of snapshots or plans or sections, and then started arranging them into my own kind of first stab at what a carpet might look like. I did another experiment with different types of telephones to create this almost cypress tree resembling object, and this used various different telephones from all ages as well. So a lot of this work was done throughout multiple software, where I was modeling in SketchUp and then I was kind of rendering in V-Ray and then bringing it into Photoshop and then arranging it separately too, adding color and so on. And although it was sort of a tedious process, the kind of depth and different steps involved really allowed for it to make it a lot more richer. And then as I iterated and kind of made them a lot more detailed, I started constructing an even bigger carpet and then almost ended up with these hybrid elements, which was really, really interesting because even the way that symbols and patterns are configured into a carpet means something. And so I wanted to kind of dissect why I was putting certain symbols and things in places and what the scales might represent on a very small sort of crumb-like scale. And this is really where I started to kind of encapsulate the narrative of the project. So you can see this one reads, "The charbug of Paradise Paradisa looks to resolve modern-day climate issues, which are becoming increasingly popular in society. In order to design a community and city which enhances the spatial experiences of man with nature, the garden utilizes concepts used in carpet construction." And so what I wanted to develop is a kind of new style of city, or initially it was housing, but then kind of turned into more of a city landscape of this kind of paradise-like, infrastructural based moving city that was completely new, completely sustainable, and used water as a, core throughout its infrastructure, but also it's kind of like a new language in terms of architectural style. I then started looking into some more infrastructural elements, especially aging infrastructure, because if I was to create this self-sustaining city, what kinds of infrastructure would I need to kind of house thousands of people, almost like a small village? And so I started modeling different kinds of elements. This is a substation that I then integrated with some of the objects that I had created earlier. So this one is obviously a 3D kind of axo view, whereas this drawing is more of a plan view. And as you can see, like the level of detail already is so high. But from this kind of plan view, it reads as a symbol or as a pattern, which I want to then weave back into the carpet sort of analogies and methodologies. I then started researching into the design process of a carpet, because obviously the thing that we usually see is the end result. And although a lot of carpets are now made on industrial machines, that's not really how they were designed in the first place. And I found out that there is a process using a Persian cartoon, which is this sort of graph paper, where each kind of square or pixel represents a knot, represents a specific color, and obviously it all comes together to create this magnificent pattern. So I started then translating my own carpet design into a black and white cartoon. And then again, kind of translating those pixels and then figuring out what kinds of knots I wanted, because this was again, there's different kinds of knots you can do to achieve specific results. And each knot means something, each knot is particular in a certain way, and the texture and the feel of the carpet all depend on things like this. So I again zoomed in a lot to then dissect some of the existing patterns that were out there and what these represented. So getting really, really into like the minuscule details. So for example, you have stuff like a very plain weave, you have a waft wrapping weave, double interlocking weave, and then I took these drawings that I had found and started photoshopping them and again hybridizing them into my own patterns. So this was kind of like a first iteration of merging those patterns together, and then a second iteration where I started to identify different elements. So I started calling this one a diamond diode. Um, this kind of looks like a bridge, and things like that. So I'm essentially trying to connect the patterns to infrastructural elements that it could represent. I then also looked into transatlantic cables, which are these huge kind of wires and things that go throughout the ocean, and then started experimenting with a software called Modo, which allowed for a lot more flexibility and detail, as opposed to things like SketchUp or Rhino. I think Modo is more on the side of Blender, if you've ever used that before, but it allowed me to kind of create my own thread and then actually model it in a way so that I could weave them within each other. And so this was like a very initial test render that I did, and you can really start to see like the texture too. So doing this digitally was a really, really kind of big breakthrough throughout the project. I then started experimenting a bit more, thinking about the ways in which this would be viewed. So this is that same diamond diode pattern that I created. And once I had done one of these, it was easy enough to kind of Photoshop and replicate and duplicate and make it a bit more thicker as well. But the basic concept is there. So I then kind of overlaid that with my initial substation kind of model as well. And this is really, again, a pivotal point in the project where I was like, okay, this is a way for me to kind of integrate these two elements that have been running in parallel so far. I was then doing various bits of research alongside this, a lot more designing, but research was still the backbone of the project. So I looked at things like the Paris carpet, which is the world's oldest carpet, and then also thought about how the city might sit in an existing landscape. Would it be an extension of an existing city, or would it be its own thing? And again, would these kind of substation networks be then kind of woven throughout? So I think this was the point where I was kind of closing up the sort of narrative for the second half. So I think for term two, and I had to kind of go away for the Christmas holidays and develop almost these like protagonists of the Paradisa carpet, similar to like the exercise that I did here, but in a more detailed and careful way. And so I came up with these protagonists, and each of them started representing different infrastructural elements, like I already mentioned. So this first one, although modeled after a substation, it actually became a sort of water substation, where water is kind of like the main element through the carpet, and this is one of many substations in one of many districts, that kind of controls all the water flow around the city. So as you can see, like essentially this is a collage, but it's also a drawing where I've got the modeling that I did in Modo at the back that's been photoshopped and repeated, and then the modeling that I did in SketchUp as well from a plan view, overlaid on top of that with some shadows so that you do get that sense of depth as well. So then the pipes and the threads almost become interchangeable, and because they're of the same scale, I think I started to delineate some of them as water pipes or, these threads that can actually carry something throughout the carpet too. This one is of a transport hub. Um, and again, I'm kind of like looking for ways to integrate these things very seamlessly together. So these kind of hybrid collages did take quite a while, but again, they kind of set the tone for what was to come. And then I started to experiment and put them all together, which was again a very initial kind of stab at doing so. And I had a discussion with my tutors of what this carpet could look like and the different kinds of districts and the construction, everything from what's at the border to, what's holding this carpet together. Does the carpet move? And if so, how does it do that? And we kind of ended up on this idea that the carpet almost hovers ever so slightly over a landscape, um, which you can see over here. So I did more research into myths and things like that to understand the scale of the carpet. And so I started putting my initial collage into different landscapes to, again, understand scale, but also develop this narrative further. And so this carpet, is a self-sustaining city. It has water as one of the main elements throughout, which is recycled, but also, really, really precious. And this kind of set the tone for the final renders that are to come as well. I then did an exercise where I was thinking about, okay, well, you've got this massive carpet city. How does it get constructed? Where does it begin? And so we kind of talked about this idea of a super loom, using elements that I, again, had started to create, but also just as a separate exercise, I guess, which is nice to do every now and then because you start working on things and you iterate and you keep going, but it can get very boring and demanding at times too. So this was a kind of nice separate side exercise that I did. So you have things like the control center and you have storage silos, the production floor, and it's almost as if this carpet gets sort of like woven and printed through this loom and then gets sent on its way. And something that I kind of didn't really expect to do was explore my ideas through drawing. Now, I'm not much of a drawer or sketcher. I never really have been. I can sketch, it's not that I can't. I just lean more towards sort of computer software as an initial kind of like ideation process. But this was a really, really nice way to kind of get back into drawing and really just consider every line to be as important as each other, similar to how in carpet construction, every knot and every thread is important to the final result. So, this initial exercise was basically looking at a corner of the carpet where I was studying what kinds of elements made up this border and how would they then work with the sort of substation element that had been kind of iterated throughout. So, for example, since we talked about the carpet being able to hover ever so slightly, these sort of like hovercraft elements were dotted throughout the border. And I then went into a bit more detail as to how that might work. So, drawing as a kind of exercise to understand, again, scale, but also layers and also the different elements and how they all work together was quite helpful because I know that if I had tried to do the same thing in a 3D software, it would have gotten so complicated. So the sort of like yellow trace that you can see kind of like woven throughout is like a very base grid of where all the threads would be, because I couldn't really depict them one by one. And then you've kind of got this like base grid running throughout with the dashes and pluses that I'll go into in a second. Um, and then you have all the, modeled elements that I had created, the patterns, and basically these drawings were a way for me to kind of arrange them. So, like I mentioned, this is the corner of the carpet. So, I then had to do 11 more drawings to kind of finish off this carpet drawing as a whole. So, these pluses and dashes that I mentioned before are actually repair and maintenance units. So it's again kind of zooming in at that scale, and kind of this idea that if for whatever reason one of the threads was damaged, it could easily be fed into this maintenance unit and repaired on the spot, on the go, so you don't have to like stop and make repairs on the way. And in that sense, the carpet is kind of like self sustaining and ever growing. So I then started to do different drawings of a similar style, using similar elements throughout so that everything was quite consistent. And I think this must have taken me like more than a month to do so. And eventually I started doing some of these drawings in parallel as well, which really helped, because sometimes when you're doing one section of a drawing, doing the rest can feel quite disconnected. So as I kind of started building up each area, I was also putting them all together and kind of assessing and going over what elements I had missed and adding on to things, and so on and so forth. So you have different kinds of districts. For example, this is the administrative district. This is the rural district, which is one of the corners of the carpet, which is kind of unfinished, and I quite liked that, where you've got one carpet of one corner of the carpet which is unfinished, because everything is still in production. It's still kind of getting made and getting kind of like created and woven and so on. The diplomatic district and the industrial district. And so I kind of like started assigning each section of this carpet its own infrastructural area in a sense. So again, it's that idea of zooming in and out. And this is more obviously on a master plan scale. So I was trying to think about, okay, well, you wouldn't really want the industrial district smack bang in the middle of the carpet. And things like housing or like the commercial sector and so on. And then in the end, it kind of came together as a square carpet drawing, which again was quite big, but I then had to translate that into a physical model. And again, model making is not one of my skills, but I figured fifth year is really the year that you can push yourself and kind of experiment and have fun with things, because we weren't really tied to any other things, any other modules or demands like technology, for example. Um, so at Greenwich, I really felt that I could kind of be as creative as possible and push things really, really far. So I started with this first panel, which resembles that first drawing that I showed you. And even the model is made up of different layers. So it starts with a black piece of paper and then a sheet of very thin kind of acrylic, clear acrylic. And I've kind of printed out patterns from my carpet collages and overlaid them within that acrylic and black sheet of paper. And then you've got, the border elements, pins, 3D printed models of the hovercraft components that run throughout the carpet as well. And then my kind of like Photoshop concoctions of the threads and also the elements that I had modeled, which have all been printed and then, well, photoshopped, printed, and then laser cut very, very carefully. So this was again a very like tedious process, involved a lot of trial and error to kind of get the laser cut to be very, very exact, which meant kind of like aligning it specifically and also working with kind of Illustrator files and line weights and things like that. And then I kind of, yeah, stuck those on, but then started layering these elements sort of at a distance so that you could get that same element of depth that was in the photoshopped collages. And I think this was a really good kind of, I think this was my second or third stab at making this panel. And it was like an A2 size too. So it was quite big and it was, allowed me to get a lot of detail into it, but again, was very, very tedious in terms of time. So, of course, the next step was then to create the next, 11 panels. And you'll see that color again plays a strong role throughout my work, because I wanted each district and each panel to have its own character and energy. and different styles of threads and the patterns and things like that. I think in total this whole model probably took me about 2 months to do. Some things I did in parallel, like these two kind of go together, which is the administrative and I think the diplomatic district. They're almost mirrored in a way. And then the final result, as you can see, when you put all the panels together, it comes to about 1.7 meters squared. So it's absolutely huge, but I'm really kind of like happy with how it turned out. And at one point I was basically filling in the gaps and also deciding on how I could make it as seamless as possible, and then feeding that kind of model image back into those renders in a desert landscape. So it's surreal to even think that this is a physical model and not a render. But yeah, it was a big feat, but I think it fit the fact that I was finishing architecture school with a project like this. So that's kind of it. That's kind of the project summed up. I know there's a lot of different elements and parts and things to it. So if you do have any questions, I'll do my very best to answer them in the comments. And I hope you all found this video quite useful. Thank you so much for watching.